Again, thank you for all being here, and I expect a lively discussion after we're done with this next speaker. It's been an exciting time, a frightening time perhaps, and we're about to hear from a person who knows it firsthand in many ways, and to introduce our next quite illustrious speaker, Ashraf Ghani, Professor Charles Hirschkin.
Thank you, Terry. My name is Charles Hirschkin. As Terry said, I'm also an anthropologist here at Berkeley. It is my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker tonight, Dr. Ashraf Ghani. Among the many coats that Dr. Ghani has worn over the years, one of the first, and I might dare to venture one of the more formative ones, has been as an anthropologist, having earned his PhD from Columbia University in 1983. His dissertation at that time focused on structures of production and domination in the present territory of Afghanistan as they developed between the 18th and 19th century, an inquiry that I have to imagine served him well later in life, much to his surprise probably. Upon graduation, Dr. Ghani taught for a semester here at Berkeley, after which he accepted a position at Johns Hopkins University, where he remained until 1991. In that year, he began working at the World Bank, focusing on large-scale institution building and structural adjustment projects, first in South and East Asia, and later in Russia, China, and India. In 2001, he returned to his native Afghanistan after many years, having accepted an appointment as special advisor to the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy to Afghanistan. He also began at that time to serve as chief advisor to the interim president, Hamid Karzai, and subsequently as finance minister during the period of the transitional government. Because of his efforts at carrying out a series of extremely important reforms as finance minister, he was voted as one of the best finance minister of Asia in 2003 by a leading financial news source. Following the 2004 election in Afghanistan, Dr. Ghani declined an offer to retain his post as finance minister and instead accepted an appointment as chancellor of Kabul University, where he received wide recognition for his efforts to promote a participatory style of governance among faculty, students, and staff. Should he ever decide to leave Afghanistan, we're hoping he comes here to Berkeley to carry out a similar task. In 2005, Dr. Ghani left the university and co-founded the Institute for State Effectiveness, an organization that has developed a citizen-centered perspective to rethink the fundamentals of the relationship between citizens, the state, and the market in the context of a globalizing world. Together with the Institute's co-founder, Claire Lockhart, he published Fixing Failed States, a framework for rebuilding a fractured world, what one reviewer described as a persuasive critique of the ill-conceived, incoherent aid complex run by the UN and other agencies, which undermines and supersedes weak states instead of stabilizing them. This topic, I might add, is not only extremely timely and important, but also one that has been a central focus for anthropologists over many years. One last milestone I will mention among Dr. Ghani's impressive career. He was a leading presidential candidate in the 2009 presidential elections in Afghanistan, with a platform that emphasized the need for fair and representative government, curbing corruption, and building a dynamic economy that would give employment to those abandoned by Afghanistan's war-torn economic order. His talk this evening is titled Creative Destruction, State Cultures and Abductive Logic. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ashraf Ghani. Is it the next one? Yes. How do I operate?
Technology. I just want to be reminded that, it doesn't work here as well as Afghanistan. So we at least have one thing in common. Is it working? Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I don't see Laura. Professor Nader. I see many friends, and it's a delight to be with you. Laura Nader is an American original. What does that mean? She's developed and used her anthropological imagination to go against the grain, to remind American society and the world at large not to take for granted its conventional wisdom, to challenge at every opportunity our received categories, to remind us that we are alive, that our function as human beings is to relate, to question, to debate in order to reach a consensus. She embodies the best of Dewey's tradition, Margaret Mead's activism, and Franz Boas's relentless critique of received categories. So first and foremost, she's a citizen who takes citizenship seriously, who has never accepted the division between objectivity and advocacy. The separation of the university from life, the price that American universities paid in order to get technical knowledge, is not something that Professor Nader has ever accepted. And because of it, her citizenship is active and continuous. She's a scholar who wields the pen much more mightily than the weapons. And as a scholar, she has questioned, received wisdom. I had the fortune to read everything she wrote until 1992 and to speak to her for 3 days. And one of those in particular is interesting. When she critiqued the nuclear industry for saying that an accident could happen, she was dismissed outright by her physicist colleagues saying it wasn't the design. You don't understand, Laura. And then 3 Mile came, and everybody said, how did you know? Because she said, design is made by people. People are not made by design. And therefore, management is not just structural, it's people, processes, and human beings. She has used anthropology to question the engagement in the received wisdom of others. She is not accepted to be Marxist or Foucaultian. She has repremised all of these giants and some not so large ones on the plane of anthropological comparative understanding. And as such, is renewed continuously. And in this regard, her commitment to teaching, which we are celebrating tonight, has been remarkable. The 50 years of teaching is left behind many of us richer, with a better understanding and with a sense that we must give. And here I must emphasize, she has been one of the few who's encouraged undergraduate students to publish and co-publish with her. While undergraduate students were being treated as needing babysitting, she treated them as full citizens. and encouraged them to carry the type of research that was groundbreaking. And a lot of work is come from those students. And then, of course, her humor. When I first saw her, somebody had the misfortune of telling her, "You're Ralph Nader's sister." And she immediately turned and said, "No, he's my brother." Yes, Ralph, I got her permission. And of course, there was Mrs. Nader, her remarkable mother, who again, each time the Nader family went to the movies, they went as a family. And each time a scene came that Mrs. Nader did not approve, she sat down, and all of them put their heads down. So I think the only person who's ever managed to censor Laura has been Mrs. Nader. Other than that, she has been the authority and guiding us. Let me take a couple of moments of the recent years. Scene one is 2006, and what do the Minister of Finance of the world say in 2006? I've read about 200 budget speeches recently. When Afghanistan is cold and I need to be in all provinces, I do what Laura wanted me to do first, to study the rest of the world from the angle that reveals it. And so cold nights in Afghanistan become very interesting in this regard. What Gordon Brown said was that thanks to his policies and that of the rest of the world, the cycles of boom and bust were over. That was the 2006 consensus, and I can quote you 200 finance minister of the time. Why is this important? Because the world convinced itself that we did not need to examine the structural underlying causes that would produce the crisis. That is the power of received wisdom. The social construct that is the consensus of the moment gets to be translated into an ideology and a dogma. The second one, I hope you can hear it. Oh, sorry. Oh. Could you help me, please? Oh, sorry.
Use this one to go forward and
Okay,
backward.
okay, that's excellent. So that's backward? Oh,
It won't show up on this
well,
one.
sure, okay, okay.
It'll just show up.
Oh, okay, that is difficult because, yeah, I need to see the screen, I'm sorry. Well, this is Alan Greenspan's conspiracy that you don't hear him. This is a very revealing incident when,
You need to press
oh, there, okay. When Waxman,
in both at the same time.
oh, both at the same time.
Yes, they're not
Yeah. Could you
One.
press that as to whether this would come? No? Well, let's see. Anyway, I told you. Well, anyway, this is a 1-minute gym. Waxman, Congress Waxman is questioning Alan Greenspan and says, so, Mr. Greenspan, you've reached the conclusion that your ideology is no longer working. And Greenspan says precisely. For 40 years, it was explaining the world, and it stopped functioning. It no longer explains the world. What was that ideology? The market knew best. There could not be market failure. And the third one, Davos 2009, one word dominated Davos in 2009. For God's sake, we need the government. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. All right.
Once each.
Once each. Is that all right now? Okay. We need the government. The government must intervene because without the government, the crisis cannot be solved. Across the board, all the captains of industry, all the billionaires, we are incapable, we are in hot water. Then we shift to Davos 2010. The nature of intervention must be discussed with us. And that reminds us exactly of what happened during the New Deal. At first, the state is required to intervene to save market failure. But the minute there is the slightest bit of stability, the dialogue shifts to saying now which piece of the pie is controlled by whom. So what does this tell us as an agenda of research and as part of an engagement of citizenship? We must shift from thinking in one dimension about time to thinking three dimensions about time. The future in the present and the future in the past. The person who captured it best was T.S. Eliot in terms of poetic imagination, and in terms of logic, it was Charles Saunders Peirce. A lady passed me by just as I came and said she actually looked the Wikipedia to see whether I'd made up the word abduction. It does not come from abducting, which has been my family business in Afghanistan for centuries. I'll explain in a moment. Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future. And time future contained in time past. What might have been and what has been point to one end, which is always present. Without elimination, both a new word and the old made explicit, understood. Our disciplines, particularly those that become statistical, logical, and more empirical, deliberately ignore the future as a break from the present. They assume a simple model of reproduction that the present is the continuation of the past and therefore projection of the future is a projection of the present. What T.S. Eliot brings to the fore is that part that could have been and has not been. Could you imagine if Ralph Nader was president of the United States instead of George Bush? That's the type of possibility that we are talking about. The current present was not the only present possible. And future of tomorrow is not the only future of those who are in positions of dominance that preach. We must take different futures as possible. And here is where Peirce comes. Abduction is the type of logic that requires a leap of faith to first imagine a future, because the future cannot be tested. It's the formation of the hypothesis that is arrived socially regarding the premises. We are not one-dimensional beings. We operate with three dimensions: the past, the present, and the future. Marcuse's lament on one-dimensional men is overdue. That's not the way we operate. And what brings this? Crises are extremely important because they allow us a litmus test. So What do crises provide? They provide open moments where dominance of structural thinking gives way to agency, to human imagination, and to the possibility of imagining different futures. 2008 was, and today is exactly such an open moment. Because from 2008 to now, we've had a rupture of understanding with the past. In the next 10 years, in the OECD countries are going to be the most difficult 10 years since the Great Depression. And during such times, all that we have received must be re-questioned, rephrased, and refought over. Because in such moments, foundational assumptions become explicit. And they, more importantly, become subject to social discussion. The very divisions of citizens are revealing of the possibility of different futures. And market failure forces back the question of what Adam Ferguson first coined and then was used by Hayek and Greenspan, that the market is of human making, but not of human design. The market now must become of human design. The failure of the market cannot be left to the market to fix, because the price has been assumed by the citizen and by the government. When market fails, the state is asked to pick it up. But when citizens fail, who picks them up? That's the moral question. And the answer to that is going to determine the question of our approach to the future. So why the citizen? And what is it that we need to think about? Long ago, I think here, maybe with Stanley and Nelson, we had a discussion because people were saying the state is very difficult to study. And my argument continuously has been, the state is extremely easy to study, because the state registers in the actions of the citizens. The state should not be studied top-down. The state should be studied bottom-up. And the first category here is, what's the legal status of the citizens? How is citizenship conceived from a legal perspective? I will come to explain the culture of the state in a bit more detail, but the first issue is citizenship is a field of battle, has been and will remain so. And today, it's more important than ever because the social contract of the last 60 years can no longer be taken for granted. That is what is at stake at this moment. How will the new social contract be negotiated, and what would be its shape? Because citizenship assumes both the obligation and the rights. And the obligation of citizenship are who pays for it and how it's paid for, but also who makes the decisions and how decisions are arrived. So Laura's engagement, again with law, has been the pioneering effort in this. To see law not as a field of fetishism, but as a field of contestation. As a field where different possibilities of boundaries of what is permitted are arrived at. One of the best recent books explaining the market failure goes to something that Laura thought about and taught for years, which is rules of the game. Who defines the rules, who interprets them, who enforces them. This book is called Fixing the Game, and it compares the NLF to the stock market. NLF's success has been that the game is continuously tweaked by referees so that the audience can enjoy it. No side gets unfair advantage. But the compensation of the executive, something that Ralph Nader is focused for decades on, twisted the game fundamentally to create two markets, an expectations market and a real market. And the expectations market determined the field of action of the executives. In order to make billions for themselves, they impoverished millions of people. Because of this, rules of the game, I think, are fundamental to understand. And the positioning of the citizens within these rules becomes the avenue of approaching the state, because that's the register of daily life. So what about state cultures? You know, we've inherited Weber, and he's dominated us the wrong way. Dewey offered a much better vision of the state, because Dewey's vision of the state was that the state does what the community wants it to do. It's not monochromatic. It's not a single functional entity. Because of that, one perspective that we must study and look at in detail, and that is the core struggle today over the definition of states, is what functions must the state perform? And where does it perform those functions? In one of the functions, of course, that the state, when I wrote about state functions and said that market regulation was one of the key functions, this was before the crisis. Everybody was saying, look, you know, he's looking at the past. And in 2008, we've talked about nothing but state market regulation. This multifunctionality of the state is the first point of departure. And that gives us the first approximation of the culture of the state. The second approximation is state structure. What position structurally that's occupied? But the third thing is state culture as a distinctive way of behavior, approach, and mentality. And then it is about agency. Agency and structure in the academy have been in tension. Today's moment requires that we bring synergy to function, structure, culture, and leadership. We cannot pulverize these because different disciplines study them. We need to bring them to a field of unity. And that's how we would be able to understand what Laura has been preaching for years, controlled comparisons. To look at both similarities and differences. The search for one theory of the state that all state must fulfill gets us to a minimalist definition. A state based on legitimate use of force alone is not going to be sufficient. That is not the state of the 21st century. That was the state during the Bavarian Revolt, which Weber discussed, but we must get to a richer discussion. In here, I want to take just the litmus test. Something that is very boring, but I learned it from Weber. When I read Weber on Islam, I said, I don't understand Islam, but he certainly doesn't. And then it became a study of 30 years of Islam, to be able to understand it. But one thing I did learn from Weber that has stayed with me and ultimately I think made me accept that very unfortunate job, which was Minister of Finance in Afghanistan. Only somebody who's totally crazy would do that. I've never been to psychiatrist, so my sanity, I think, is in doubt, serious doubt, but not certified. This is the budget. What Weber emphasized is that if one wants to see, one should trace the money. In tracing the money has been a preoccupation since my undergraduate days when I read Weber, because the fundamental lesson of sociology of religion is that those who do not work must secure the resources from those who work to allow them not to work. The budget here becomes an arena. So now let me shift to budgets. In terms of budgets, this is based again on the study of these 200 or over 200 budget speeches from 2006 to now, and work in about 60 countries around the world. One is that the rules of the game formally are one thing, substantively they are predatory and fragmented. There are at least 60 countries around the world, possibly 100, where the formal systems are designed for stealing, for predatory behavior. And this is where differentiation comes. The second area, which was really the turn of the 19th century shift, is predictability and control. This is Weber's bureaucratic man. The way Marx describes the alienation of the worker from the means of production, Weber describes the alienation of the administrator from the means of administration. So it becomes a functionary. Control systems become the end. Results are not the issue. It is compliance. That is law as restriction, and state culture as minimalist. The third shift is towards program and functional focus. It's here that delivery of programs becomes the critical issue. And the fourth one is performance and state-level integration. One of the significant challenges that we face today is state fragmentation itself between functions. The most difficult transitions are from 1 to 2 and from 3 to 4. Why? Because programs become prerogatives of ministries, and particularly in coalition politics, political parties. Europe now faces the major problem of not moving from program to integrated level state. And the issues of our time require much more holistic perspective. 2 examples. How do you deal with SARS? Or how do you deal with aging? You cannot create a Ministry of Aging in a population where either 60% of population is under 20 or 50% is going to be over 60. Because the previous approach during the third type of accountability is to create a function around a need that is arisen. But coordination in itself becomes the large problem. And it is the problem of coordination. Very few governments are able to tackle this. So let me just pick some examples to ground this empirically. The thing that might surprise people most, it's extremely difficult to spend money by a government. Most governments have enormous difficulty spending money. Today, I give you just 3 examples. Botswana, Spain, and the United States of America. The US has had enormous difficulty spending its stimulus package in terms of results. Spain the same way. And Botswana. Why? In the United States, because of gridlock. And because a lot of the government functionaries are incapable of moving rapidly. Spain focused the large industries where the dynamic was in small and medium. So it needs to be understood that part of the reason, again, for not overcoming the crisis is precisely the lack of capability to move rapidly. Bringing it from a controlled comparison perspective, look at the contrast. Canada, within 76 days, spent 87% of its stimulus package. Over 6,000 projects moved from conception to implementation within 100 days. And who did they borrow the 100-day concept from? From Roosevelt. How did they do it? They changed all their budget procedures, so routine was overcome. Things that would have taken 1 year to reach agreement on were done in 1 month. And the right coalitions were built. Canada is the first OECD country to come out of the financial crisis. Singapore did one better, but then, of course, they're distinctive. They actually have paid back everything that they borrowed from their future fund. Within a year, all that they had planned was implemented, and they went from 4% negative growth to over 10% double-digit positive growth. And this, of course, brings the question that state is not just structure, it's agency. Leadership matters. Understanding matters, the type of coalitions and the type of relationships matter. Because state theory has been fixated upon structure. It cannot be done because it's structurally impossible to do it. Well, but that's paralysis by analysis. And the point that comes repeatedly, of course, is back to the budget. When you're dealing with money, no matter how large it is finally finite. So it becomes a very good indicator of allowing one to study the struggles both over distribution and over redistribution. The state distributes through rules of the game. It redistributes through the functions that it chooses to perform or not to perform. And that's where the markers of opportunity come. So we are able to deal with this in a sustained analytic way as well as through proper engagement. Now to abduction. Peirce's major contribution, and now he's been acknowledged because Dewey was a student, to be the founder of pragmatism, is that perception, its first contribution, is socially conditioned. It's product of the social struggle and boundaries of social consensus. And as a student and interlocutor of de Morgan, of course, the category that Bourdieu has used only part of it, is that a universe of discourse is both a universe of agreement and a universe of disagreement. Doxa does not exist socially. Social consensus is time-bound and changes. And because of it, if we are going to move from the present to the future, we cannot test our hypotheses in the normal way. So Peirce changes the logic. Abduction comes first, which is formation of hypothesis for the future. Then induction and deduction are based for the use of those tests. And the entire mechanism connects socially. This is where our roles as a community in a scholarly place or in a university connects back to social responsibility. The university has had a major contribution to the current financial crisis, particularly through the Chicago School of Business. There's a wonderful book that just come out called The Myth of the Rational Market. And it provides an overview of the key academic discussions where the market always knows best. What is most interesting is that the founders of this discourse had reached fully before the crisis the understanding that the market actually was not rational, fully rational. But and very few of them actually ever were able to make any money from the market. So those who analyze it actually can't practice it. But an entire generation is grown, several generations, actually 3 generations, in the belief in the perfectibility of the market. And that meant subordination of governance, of state policy, and of citizenry to the will of the market. But in today's construct, again, we cannot have the market just define us. The market is not, as this crisis has shown, just of human making. When its failure comes, it becomes very much one of human design. And then it depends who has a seat at the table and who determines the new round of the rules of the game. And it's here that universities come again to play. When the market needs regulation, who do they reach for? Ralph Nader has repeatedly pointed out to those very people who are responsible for the market failure. Because the open door is they are the only ones who have experience with the failure, so they have to ask them to fix it. But the ground of training at the university and its engagement, I think, requires a serious re-examination so we can connect again. And let me conclude back with Laura's and my mentor. Margaret Mead said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." Thank you. Before my distinguished commentator starts his comment, let me offer an apology. I was dealing with burning of the Quran in strategic relationship, and 4 times was prevented literally from the airport to come. So my apologies for not giving you a text. But you're the masters of discourse, and I'm sure spontaneously you'd be a lot more brutal and frank than if you had a text. You would have been a lot more politer. So please, thank you.
Our Master of Discourse this evening is Professor Nazar As-Sayad, who is the chair for the Center of Middle East Studies and also a professor of architecture, planning, and urban history. Nazar,
Thank you.
please.
Thank you very much. It is indeed a pleasure to be here and to witness this amazing gathering in celebration of a giant of this campus, Laura Nader. Like Dr. Ghani, I was also on my way here, even though I live in Berkeley, I'm a professor in Berkeley, but I was in France for the last 2 days. And my flight was delayed, so I actually arrived only a few hours ago, only to be stopped at the airport by an immigration officer who, knowing that my origin is from Egypt, because it says on my passport that I was born in Egypt, wanted to know my opinion of the Muslim Brotherhood. And went on to ask me if I was in fact a member of the Brotherhood. He didn't actually say Muslim Brotherhood, he just said the Brotherhood. And I was a bit puzzled which Brotherhood he was talking about initially. So I am really, as Dr. Rani just mentioned, not only did I not have the paper, I also am really no discussant here. I am here mainly as a way of engaging him and all of you in some of the issues that may have been raised. Clearly, I'm not an anthropologist, and my role is to not even engage a discipline. In fact, I think it took me a couple of decades to be able to understand what anthropology actually is. I am trained as an urban historian, and I realize that anthropologists sometimes, in fact, use my work. I love their work, and I use it, not necessarily because they're anthropologists, but because some of them produce amazing work. One of the things that I'm really interested in here, in bringing into the discussion, is Dr. Rani's work specifically as a policymaker, as a finance minister, and in fact, as a candidate for president of Afghanistan at one point in time. And how anthropology may have played a role in all of these different roles. On the flight, I actually had access to the internet, which is something new in airlines right now. So I was checking, anthropologist, politician. Not a lot popped out. But an article by Rosemary Joyce about Nick Clegg, the Deputy Prime Minister of Britain, popped out. Apparently, he is an anthropologist, something I did not know. And it made me actually think about the role that anthropologists often play in the real world. Anthropologists have a long tradition of prescient diagnosis of society. Often possessing considerable knowledge of culture and history, knowledge that is not necessarily always accepted or known or even disseminated by the media, because it's often considered too narrow or too specific. But clearly, they have been playing increasingly an important role in educating the public and informing policy. And with the likes of Laura Nader and Ashraf Ghani, clearly we see the direction that this is going. If I were to reflect upon some of what we heard today, and as I said, I'm not really providing any comments, I have questions. Dr. Ghani spoke specifically about paralysis by analysis. I think this metaphor is really important. I think he actually talks about it mainly in the context of the planning of budgets. But I think in this country today, we actually often have paralysis as a result of analysis at every single level, political level, academic level, even within our state capital, we have that happening as well. He also spoke about how is it that those who analyze the market do not always practice it. And that's very interesting because, in a sense, this division that has occurred, and definitely is something that I think you see particularly in the disciplines that have to do with the professional schools. So I teach in a school of architecture and planning, and what we have are architecture and planning educators who educate the next generation of architects and planners, if you will. But then what we have are also architects and planners out there who have absolutely no connection whatsoever to the Academy of Architecture and Planning. Are we reaching that same point in economics? Are we reaching it in public policy? I'm not really sure that that's the case. In fact, and I think Dr. Ghani pointed that out at the end, that the Academy still plays a major role in the formulation of public policy in very specific respects. Certainly, it has played a major role in health, and it still does in the Obama administration. It plays a major role in economics. We can actually see the connections between Wall Street and between very specific business schools and departments of economics around the country. The notion that the state and the citizens have come to submit to the market, and that this has become a common wisdom almost everywhere. In fact, I find it amazing that today, as we see the developments that are going on through the Arab Spring, whether they are revolutions or uprisings is still up for debate. We see that one of the things that is not really being questioned whatsoever, ironically, are the same neoliberal economics that have been adopted by the regimes that supposedly were overthrown by these revolutions. So today, the model that the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, for example, would hope to follow economically, and only economically, not necessarily politically, is the AK Party in Turkey, because they have adopted a very specific neoliberal direction that the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt feels, well, it has worked for them, and at the same time, it has worked also in Egypt under Mubarak, so why question it altogether? So the notion that, in a sense, to be able to make a few wealthier, a lot of us have to become poorer is, in a sense, the direction that we're moving into. I think one of the things also that Dr. Ghani did not necessarily talk about, but as you know, that's one of the things that he and Professor Nader had worked on, is this beautiful edited volume in which the ideas of law come into focus. The issue here is, where is it that the law facilitates these very specific conditions of a transfer of wealth and a transfer of authority? To what extent are we left with a situation in many of these countries where even under the rubric of revolution, where people supposedly have taken control of their own destiny and their own life, issues of regulations, issues of inherited structures can no longer be questioned? And here actually comes a few of my questions for Dr. Ghani. First, the notion of being able to move from an institution like the World Bank to a country like Afghanistan, which had literally collapsed as a result of the war that we embarked on, and working in a very specific situation where money had to flow from elsewhere with lots of strings attached. So how do you manage, as a finance minister, but who's an anthropologist, remember that, with all of these strings attached that may come with specific money that has a very specific intent in a country that, at least for the previous 10, 15 years, was a complete mess? A second question has to also do with, what is it that makes one, as one aspires to serve one's own country? And clearly Dr. Ghani attempted to do that by challenging Hamid Karzai in the election, unsuccessfully. But the challenge itself, if you go back and even read the news reports from that time, he was his finance minister, yet he became his challenger. What I'm very interested in hearing about is, to what extent has your anthropological training prepared you to run for office? And specifically, I mean, it would really be great in this country. I mean, we've had a lot of presidents who've gone to school, but few, if any of them, were scholars. It would be great to see a scholar lead this country at some point in time in the future. It may not happen in our lifetime, but one can at least wish. So what I'm interested in learning is how is it that you've managed to bring Weber to bear on your run for president, for example? And finally, and I think this basically goes to the heart of who you are, as someone who is absolutely steeped in very specific theoretical discourses, but you're also a man of the world. You live in the world that requires you to communicate with the likes of the president of the World Bank and the president of the IMF and the president of the United States. How do you manage all of these things together?
All right. You know, these urban planners are really tricky people. They not only shape our environment, they restrict it. So thank you. First, three excellent questions. You know, when I became finance minister, there was not a cent in the Afghan budget, not one cent. And I was asked 5 times to become Minister of Interior or Vice President. I turned them down. Nobody wanted the job of finance. I said I'd take it. Why did I take it, and what did I do with it? And how did anthropology come into it? one illustration. Afghan villages had never received the right to decide on anything in the last 2,000 years. I channeled $1 billion to 29,000 Afghan villages where decision-making is invested in elected bodies that they elect, in men and women. This is in the immediate wake of the Taliban. So the struggle partly was with NGOs. They had two major problems with the approach. One was saying I'd been away for 24 years, and how was I insisting that Afghan women participate in decision-making? And my answer was a typical Laura Nader answer. Have you ever dealt with my grandmother? I mean, these men used to come with their big mustaches and large turbans to the outer house and say, we're going to talk to her. And when they would come inside, they would be shivering. Look, I mean, class matters. Poor woman or one category of woman. But my grandmother controlled 2,000 acres of land. And there wasn't a man born, including her 6 sons, that was going to stand up to her. The issue was not law. Muslim law allows enormous set of privileges. The issue is resources. And second, they said Afghan villages have inherited leadership. And you should go through a patron-client network. Well, of course, I'd foster all this, the Berkeley School, Eric Wolf, work on brokers that Clifford Geertz generalized and publicized as brokers. But the first study was done by Eric, as Laura recalls. I said, I don't accept brokers. And they said, you're being dogmatic. I said, if they want to elect their brokers, what's your problem? As it turned out, 70% of the villages did not. This is where the anthropological understanding matters. Agency is invested in people. It derives from the rule of the game. You shape the rules. And the other was, a decision. Was I going to decide for 30,000 villages as to what they should do, or do they know better? And today, the caliber of the Afghan village councils is much higher than the caliber of the Afghan cabinet. How do you talk to people like the World Bank and others? This is which was a decision. When I left Johns Hopkins, I left one of the most comfortable jobs in the world for one of the most uncomfortable jobs in the world, which was the World Bank. I used to be in the field. My apologies to my wife and my family. It's our anniversary tonight, 37th, and they are in the audience. So thank you, Rula, for tolerating all those absences. Control of discourse matters. This is where the universe of discourse matters. One has to control the language of the World Bank in order to be able to change it. I got cash from the World Bank and from the Asian Development Bank that they had never given to middle-income countries, because I wrote programs that they never had been able to implement in middle-income countries, and they were fully complied with. So by shaping the same rules of the game, you come. The issue here is, in the same talk, how do you talk to the President of the United States? When President Obama came, I told him, your contractors are destroying my country. One has to have the courage of one's conviction. But one has to be able to overcome the or question. Binary thinking has been our problem. It has all been about secular or religious, modern or traditional. Societies are not about ours. They are about end. I don't wear a suit. I don't wear a tie. I'm in local clothes. In the last 12 weeks, I've been through 23 of Afghanistan's provinces, carrying out an immense process of consultation as to how prepare Afghanistan for 2014. The anthropological perspective begins from the user. The other perspectives begins from ideological constructs. That is the difference. Agency is invested in people. And as long as you take people's agency seriously, then you are able to construct. So how does one run a Ministry of Finance? By dealing with the core rules, systems, processes. You know, two of the things that I did as Minister of Finance, I think there were 6 assassination attempts because of one of them, and probably 12. And I'll just tell you a story. You know, this will give you an illustration. We're in the cabinet, and all our top generals, this was 2002, came suddenly and knocked on the door, and in the old tradition, they said, we want to report an injustice and ask the president for justice. So he said, come on in. They came and said, we have a complaint of injustice against Dr. Ghani. He's refusing to pay us. Karzai is enormously astute. So he looks at me and says, he always calls me doctor. Doctor said, you don't have money, that's why you're not paying them. I said, no, I'm not paying them on principle. I took an oath not to pay people who don't exist. And so they said, well, you know, we are very nice people. We'll never threaten him. But the colonels, we cannot control. They're likely to kill him. And Karzai looks back and says, there's such a long line of people who want to kill him. Go take a number. I cut down the militia from 700,000 to 8,000 within 2 years. It was discipline of detail. Where Foucault is right, there's a lot of things I have no use for him, including his imposition of a remote past on a present. And it was a tragedy in the academy with his dominance, because he prevented us from researching and from imagining the future. He had no understanding of macropolitics, but took it for granted, and therefore focused on microprocesses that were interesting. But the discipline of detail matters. One has to know and be able to operate. So in that term, but the fundamental issue of a Ministry of Finance is to look at what I articulated, namely back at construction of citizenship. And that comes through rights and obligations. So you prepare a vision. I prepared the vision of Afghanistan, and this gives you an indication. So I'll stop unless you have other questions, no, the aspiration question, so that the audience can participate.
Exactly. I think this is a good moment to open it up to questions. So please use either of the 2 microphones on the side. Stefania, go ahead.
Thank you for an amazing talk and an amazing discussion, actually, of some of your talk that you just gave. And I want to ask you to pursue that discussion in terms of the 2 concepts that you developed in your talk. And I would like to ask you to speak a little bit more about the importance of the concept of crisis in what you were saying, in terms of the possibility of opening up the actuality of a future, which is not just a reproduction of a past. When I was listening to you, I was thinking of Rainer Koselleck, and Koselleck talking about modernity and actually the coming into the moving of the world into the space of what he calls prognosis, which for Koselleck takes the place of prophecy and becomes something that can be statistically measured and an extension of the present, which ends up into a flat territory in which transformation cannot happen. Of course, Koselleck also sees some of the events in the Second World War but the distraction that was brought about as something that brings back a paradoxical space of prophecy, visionary dreams of a future to come that happened during Nazi Germany. And I was wondering in what sense you are talking about crisis as a moment that actually could bring the possibility of human agency in conditions of new visibility and also transformation that is political but is also subjective transformation. And I want to ask you to talk more about this at a time in which crisis is one of the rules of the game in international governance. There are, emergency intervention, humanitarian interventions in the name of crisis, in which crisis is routinized. So what does it mean to bring crisis back in a strong sense? And my second half of the question is about then, and to talk a little bit more about your Afghanistan experience, and what does it mean to think about the possibility of a country that has endured so much distraction to actually to imagine that people would be free to imagine? What does it mean to actually think about the possibility of a space of imagination in the aftermath of collective trauma and collective distraction? And Fanon would have said that this is problematic. Do we believe it's still possible?
Do you want to take a few questions? Yeah, sure. Why don't we take a couple more questions?
Dr. Ghani, I was interested in your view, since you were in the finance ministry, about you were delineating the elements of state cultures, and you listed 5 basic elements of state culture, and you mentioned budget as the last one. But I was interested in what your view is of political economy or economics as part of state culture, since it has so much impact, and we've seen since the crisis of 2008, which most of the 10,000 American economists and financial writers miss totally with their theoretical tools. So the question of economics, I'd be very interested from the point of view of anthropologists, what is their contribution to the fact that our economists basically, with a few exceptions, Nouriel Roubini, et cetera, missed this crisis, which we are not out of. We're in the middle of this crisis, which is creative destruction of our cultures, of our states around the world, local and federal, et cetera. So I'm interested in what an anthropologist would view on this crisis and the failure of most economists, particularly the major schools, the Chicago, the Neo-Keynesian, they missed it. So what is an anthropologist's insight, and particularly given your experience, these waves of the world economy where trillions of dollars in derivatives and capital slosh around the world and take down whole regions like Southeast Asia? They take these regions down.
I think that's very clear. Thank you.
Afghans are like wildflowers. When I became Chancellor of Kabul University, I spoke for 3 months to 9,000 students to diagnose the conditions of the university and to provide a mechanism of the future. They had 40 minutes in groups of 20. They could discuss anything, but the trick was they had to limit themselves to 5 minutes of presentation and identify the 5 top issues of the university. Had I done that at Berkeley, it would have taken $100 million in two years. And what they came with was astounding in terms of a transformation agenda. Because why? A country that has been in 30 years of crisis has created conditions of resilience, capability to think outside the box, capability to think originally. That is the profound contribution. Why do I stay in Afghanistan? Because of my respect for the ordinary Afghans. Our ability as a society to cope with violence, to cope with drugs, to cope with destruction is remarkable tribute to human dignity. And it's that dignity that becomes the foundation. The problem of the West is that it talks to the wrong Afghans and it supported the wrong Afghans. I just give you one illustration. A woman on a radio 9 years ago heard that electricity could be produced from water. All the men had migrated. So she organized everything to bring the well to generate power. Literally building it stone by stone. Today the village has electricity. One word on a radio. 91% of Afghan men, 87% of Afghan women listen to 4 radio stations a day. They're so much better informed than me about international issues. It's amazing when I go to any place. Why? Because it matters. The op-eds that are written in Washington Post or New York Times or Los Angeles Times are translated every night and listened to by the villagers. We are not living in 2 different worlds. So that's my first response. The academic discourse constructs dummies because we think we are smart. We are not. They are. Let any academic survive in an Afghan village for a year and we'll understand what is the capacity for resilience. So I think it's important to put the cart and the horse and the right place. The notion of crisis that I was using was restricted to developed economies tonight, because I wanted to get out of Afghanistan. You know, it's nice not to be. I mean, back in a suit for Laura, I would have never put on a suit and a tie, and unless it was. But I don't wear Afghan clothes outside. We still some connections here. It is when the structural conditions that have been taken for granted over a specific duration of time no longer become feasible that a crisis is produced. In 2006, anyone who would have raised the question of state regulation would have been shot by most academics in most departments of economics around this country and in the world, because it was an item of faith. The crisis made possible the scene that I described to you in Davos, or the scene of Alan Greenspan, because it is so profound that it cannot be denied. And a lot of the times, denial is extremely powerful because we dismiss what does not fit our preconceived notions. The advantage of a crisis is that highlights the possibility that deniability is no longer the case. Listen to the television discussions. They're quoting Karl Marx, for God's sake, in the financial pages. That is where the advantage comes. And because of this, if you take Singapore, for instance, Singapore is basing its entire strategy of managing its future by being prepared for continuous crisis in the global economy. So it takes that as precondition. And as a result, it is dealing with multiple futures in different fields of maneuver. But that is a level of unity that is extremely rare. In a more complex set of places, this is why Canada was of such interest to me, because that offers a different set of possibilities. So it's not anti-democratic, etc. That about the notion of crisis. Second, about the state culture. You know, first, again, I'll give you an anecdote. When I started working in Russia in 1996, there were 200 economists, and none of them could figure out how to pay the Russian coal miners. I figured out in 6 months and paid them in full and on time. They had never been paid in history. Deductive logic is not productive of pragmatic solutions. The anthropological contribution is stitching capabilities. Because when you come from an economist discipline, you always look about lack, what does not exist. It's based on notions of absence. So look at the history of the World Bank. First, it was infrastructure that was lacking. It's the gap. Then it was education. Then it was, human capital. So they keep renaming it. But they never look at the possibility of what exists. And how do you stitch these capabilities together? I did not bring a single foreign advisor. It was all existing elements in Russia that I put together to make a payment system that people were paid on full and on time. So it goes back to the disciplinary construction. If you look at the Encyclopedia of Social Sciences, the first edition, 1929 to 35, the greatest lament in that encyclopedia is about the total breakdown of economics as a discipline. And now, again, you're finding the same things. I find that very easy to work, for instance, with engineers or lawyers. Their discourse is structured, and one gets within that discourse. A lot of people accuse me of being an economist. Well, I've read more probably than most of them, but that's because as an anthropologist, you keep acquiring disciplines like you're acquiring languages. You speak 5 languages, you acquire 5 disciplines. So what's the problem? Another language is acquired, and you understand the categories, and you manipulate it. It's for a good purpose. But seriously, and the speaker's observation, the second speaker's observation was an extremely serious point. The limits of vision of the most significant economists of the last 20 years has taken a huge toll on this country. In the last 4 years has shown the failure of imagination to craft the type of policies that would get us out of this crisis. And the biggest illustration of this is, again, the IMF. Each time in the last 3 years, you read the key report, they're saying the crisis each 6 months gets deeper. While each time before that, they were saying it was around the corner to be solved. So the discipline needs serious reconstruction. On last issue, the question of warlords. The program that I had the privilege of designing, National Solidarity, got them out of the villages. The minute the rules of the game changed in the village, they were out. None of them was elected. Afghanistan has 5 levels of governance: the village, the district, the municipality, the province, and the center. Then our colleagues delivered the rest of the, they were mercenaries. A lot of them had performed a function for which they didn't pay it. And instead of being thanked and given some more money, they were given the country. And the price of that has been a lot of American lives and a lot more Afghan lives. And again, it goes to the construct, because the construct of intelligence services and others was that this was a country of warlords. Images matter, the metaphors through which we proceed, and that again is the core of anthropology, and of course at the home of metaphors, the author of metaphors we live by. We need to understand people we've not met in countries we have not visited, or the places about which we hold very firm opinions. They're very easy to generalize about, because we put together large images out of fragments, but those fragments are put together.
May I ask a question?
Of course.
Two very pointed questions. One, what is your view of anthropologists being used by U.S. contractors in the military in Afghanistan, not only to teach them about customs and practices of the various tribal areas, but to actually sit in interrogations and advise the interrogators. So the anthropologist is one. And the second is, you're probably the world's leading scholar on corruption in a very granular way. And the headline in the New York Times today is the Afghan graft is upsetting the relations with the U.S. Could you comment on the U.S. graft in Afghanistan with contractors and military and $100 bills, as well as the function of graft and corruption and the definition of it and its utilization at various levels within Afghanistan by Afghanis?
Sure. The answer to the first question is very simple. They're not anthropologists, they're mercenaries. I have no use for them. And all disciplines have produced mercenaries. And this is another category. This is not cultural understanding, it's abuse of the discipline. You know, some colleagues tried to lobby me some years back to support this effort. And it's a line in the sand. I mean, the position that Eric Wolf took on Vietnam is the position that should be the position of the American Anthropological Association, every anthropologist in the world. This is not our business. Corruption. Well, first, corruption has been approached from a moral perspective. Abuse of public office for private gain. Corruption is fundamentally about a crooked playing field. So let me give you illustrations. First, US assistance. Between the public intention and the result intervenes the Beltway bandits. Out of $1, 75 to 90 cents ends back in Washington. That is a structure because the outsourcing of government that began in the 1960s, 70s, reached in 80s, it's reached a point where now the government cannot regulate. It's back to the master-slave problem of Hegel. Who's the master and who's the slave? And with the open door policy in the United States, there's no ground. You know, I mean, every three-star general and every director of the aid system is looking for a private sector job long before they retire. The sense of public service that produced the fundamental changes in this country after World War II and made the transformation of Japan, Germany, and others possible is not possible with the current modality of aid. I rather have none of it than this level. Two, narcotics. Narcotics is an upside-down problem. In 9 years, for which we had data from 2001 to 2010, this is UNODC, the UN Organization for Drugs. International drug traffickers acquired between $420 and $460 billion from Afghan narcotics trade, largely centered in Europe. The largest catch in Europe of narcotics has been less than 1 ton. Less than 1 ton. Not a single European country has caught more than 1 ton of drugs. So 460 billion. 18 billion went to Afghan traffickers. At top of them, 35 individuals. And 6.1 billion is gone to 1.7 million farmers. And narcotics has got two sides. Heroin is the consumption habit of the middle class in the West. The way these other drugs are the other way around. Why is it that no single government in the West has the moral strength to either legalize the damn thing where the Afghan advantage would disappear tomorrow, or underwrite a fundamental transformation of Afghanistan's rural life, so it does not require, what does that take? 135,000 kilometers of roads alone to do what Thailand did. So we are having both sides of it. And on contractor, so I have a paper, 7 drivers of corruption. At times the pyramid is upside internationally, at the other side it's Afghan. But it is a relationship. Corruption today is the ugly side of semi-globalization. The deregulation of finance is made it possible to transfer the money. Money moves, people don't. And the movement of money in illicit commodities combines into a system. The illicit economy globally is 1.7 trillion a year. Afghanistan certainly figures in the top 10, but they've not yet quantified. So we have a fundamental issue here in terms of the contractor culture again. So just one illustration again. There was a project in Helmand, I think $120 million. At the end, it was approximately $2 million that was actually spent in Helmand, and that again on building of houses and renting of air conditioners and generators. The rest of it was all so-called advice. Well, let's have a consultative process and see how many Afghans can come quickly with solutions, because we always hide to point out the negative. Yes, the majority of the Afghans are illiterate. But does illiteracy result in lack of capability to think? Let's have a discourse and see who will win in a debate. We need to understand, again, I think the basic set of propositions, because the negative set of constructs, the disabilities that supposedly inhere, are the ones that get to be highlighted, not what they are capable of doing. The women who with their fingers do the best embroidery without having gone, that's the school of life. And that respect for the school of life, I think, is what needs to become the agenda. Because the reason I became an expert on corruption, so-called, is because the Afghan public wanted me to deal with it. And it's that participatory dialogue, again, I think is going to be fundamental to this. And the two societies need to find common ground in terms of common interest. And I think that's where the future will be. But the news, of course, is only semi-encouraging, if not outright discouraging at that point.
Dr. Khan, let me ask you one question, and then maybe we'll wrap it up. And that is, you've spoken a lot about the sort of political and economic challenges that Afghanis face, but you've spoken less about the way in which the exercise of American power in the region is both an enabling and disenabling condition for the future that you might imagine. And I know that you've done, extensive work even on your dissertation about structures of domination in the context of British colonialism. And I'm wondering how much that enables you to think about both the pitfalls, the dangers, the limits, the kind of obstacles that one faces, that Afghanis face, given the, let's say, strategic interest of the United States in the region. I don't know if that's a safe question here, but I'm hoping it is.
It is a safe question. All questions are safe. Kipling said that Afghans were savages, but you need to watch because they knew how to shoot. 3,000 pounds of education falls to a 2-rupee bullet. We don't believe in structures. We believe in agency. We have existed because of our will to overcome obstacles. And the problem recently is that all our problems have become American problems. They cannot be. We, as Afghans, and I'm here speaking distinctively as a citizen, it came to a moment of choice to have an American passport or an Afghan passport. I chose an Afghan passport because the young people with whom I deal and the old ones asked me not to have an American passport. What did an American passport represent to them? Insurance. They wanted me to take the jump, to feel that I would have a single entry visa to the United States, which is now normal, stand in line, and be fingerprinted. And when they see me in line, tens of them come. American engagement is a fact, but the structuring of that is an Afghan issue. There is the rules of the game have three variations. One, America has the capability, knowledge, wisdom, and ability to plan Afghanistan. This it does not have. You're not an imperial power by construct. You don't have those skills, you never acquired them. You've been bad. Even in the Philippines, you couldn't do it. And, Schumpeter is right in that regard. America is not having that type of enterprise. Two, Afghans determined the rules of the game within which America configured. And this, again, was not possible when there is an overwhelming imbalance. Three, the rules of the game are constructed jointly around common interests. Here, I'm strictly Palmersonian. There are no permanent friends, no permanent enemies. Countries have permanent interests. And I represent Afghan interests unabashedly and argue for them. But there is then, what is Afghan interest? For me, it's the poor, it's the women, and it's the youth. Those three categories are the ones that I care. The people who become billionaires are not my problem. They're going to disappear from the scene when the nature of power shifts.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Ghani for that very rich discussion.